Hello. Okay, so hello everyone. They've asked me to already get started. We're a bit running a bit late from our session. So my name is Rajnia De Vito. I am a campaign associate at the Feminists for People's Vaccine Campaign, which is hosted by Dawn, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. And to start our session, we would like to do a tribute before. So Brazil and the world and me and all of the activists here from Brazil have suffered a great loss very recently. We've lost our colleague and friend and fellow activist, Jorge Bellocchi, and he still is a pioneer activist for access to medicine, for access to antiretrovirals in Brazil and actually in the world. And we were just mentioning, right, in the previous session, the need for doing justice and doing justice in remembering our loved ones and the people who were so important to our history and to our movements. So we lost Bellocchi, but we remain with his legacy and such an important legacy that we've and this event, right, is also only possible because of his achievements and his struggles. Would anyone like to say one or two words about Bellocchi, or can I move on? Yes. So you can play the video, the tribute video, please. Sorry about the hiccups. We should just start. So just to let you know, this is a PowerPoint of photos. It doesn't have audio, but we thought there was.
Eu não queria fazer o teste na época, porque era a década de 80, porque não tinha tratamento. Então, para que eu ia querer?
Thank you so much for sharing this video with us. And I'd like to welcome you all to this first session of the Why Health Justice Matters conference that's bringing together two critical movements with a shared goal: create a more equitable and sustainable world for all. We know that climate change and health inequalities are interconnected, and marginalized communities are affected by both. So we hope this whole event in our first session will help us explore links between the two movements and identify strategies for working together for a better world. We're very excited to have you all here, looking forward to a productive session, and I'd like to introduce the panel. We have Solange Baptiste from the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition, Richard Parker from the Brazilian Interdisciplinary AIDS Association, and Francisco Parra from, sorry for the English accent on your name, Francisco Parra from the Climate Tracker, Latin America and the Caribbean. And co-moderating with me will be Rajnia from the Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. And myself, Milena Sergeeva from the Global Climate and Health Alliance. I'm the liaison officer for Latin America and the Caribbean. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Richard Parker with this presentation on where we are in the health justice movement, where it came from, and what are some key opportunities and risks that we see in the movement. The floor is yours.
Do I have a mic here? It works? Yes, I think so. Okay, so without further ado, thank you to Fatima and the organizing committee for the invitation to participate. It's especially nice to participate in a meeting where Reinaldo Guimarães was one of the first speakers. Reinaldo may not even remember it, but he helped me very much about 35 years ago to get my first job in Brazil. So it's nice to be here with him. To situate or contextualize the current landscape of the health justice movement, it's important to recognize that the struggle for health justice has a long history, and that this history, in relation to what we might think of as health worldwide, begins, above all else, with health injustice. The genealogy of health worldwide, what we today call global health, has at least three distinct phases, starting with tropical or colonial medicine, then moving into what became called international health, and finally, only a couple of decades ago, being relabeled as global health. When we think of global health today, as it was in the mid-19th century, during the age of empire, it was almost exclusively concerned with protecting white European colonists from what were perceived as the health threats that they encountered in the tropics. The profoundly racialized nature of this capitalist system can be highlighted by remembering that slavery still existed legally in countries like the USA and Brazil at the time when tropical or colonial medicine emerged, and that it showed little or no concern for the health conditions affecting non-white colonized populations, a situation that only changed gradually over time as colonized populations became the labor force of the colonial, imperial, capitalist enterprises in the tropics. Biomedicine is thus, from the very beginning, linked at the hip with global capitalism and capitalist imperialist expansion, primarily focused on seeking to protect the human and financial resources of the capitalist system in the age of empire. And public health, as a field growing out of medicine to address the health of populations, was similarly linked to the growth of capitalism, with nearly all of the first schools of public health described at the time as hygiene and tropical medicine, such as the London School, being founded through endowments from wealthy entrepreneurs whose fortunes resulted from their colonial enterprises. There are some similarities with the present. Concern with what we think of today as health justice only begins very timidly to emerge in the late 19th century, with the work of people like Rudolf Virchow and others who began to focus on how social inequalities impact health and illness in what would come to be known as social medicine. Precisely because this international meeting on the interface between health justice and climate justice is being held in the Latin American region, it's important to emphasize that this region has been a true leader in terms of highlighting the importance of social medicine. Concern with the role of social inequalities in shaping health and illness, with the importance of the social and political determinants of ill health, has been a key part of the Latin American tradition since the early 20th century, shaping uniquely politicized approaches to social epidemiology and a broader vision of what in many parts of the region is described not just as public health, but as collective health. Could you advance the slides? My clicker isn't working. Okay. Okay, thanks. Perhaps because of this early emphasis on the social and political determinants of health, Latin American actors made important contributions to developing new approaches to health worldwide as the European colonial empires began to disintegrate, and especially as a new international order emerged at the end of the Second World War in the mid to late 1940s. With the creation of the United Nations, and especially with the founding of the World Health Organization, and not coincidentally, passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, both in 1948, a new phase in the genealogy of health worldwide was initiated, typically described as the period of international health. In contrast to tropical or colonial medicine, international health focused more heavily on the interactions of independent nation states. New mechanisms for cross-national cooperation coincided with a growing emphasis on public health rather than tropical or colonial medicine, which became the primary conceptual framework guiding the response to health challenges in international contexts. This emphasis was linked to the goals of achieving greater international regulatory cooperation and developing health interventions within a broader context of health systems and health policy, capable of articulating actions both nationally and internationally. Perhaps the most important advance in this new system was the creation of a more democratic structure in which the old sites of empire could be reconceived as independent countries in their own right, and were given at least a place at the table in discussions and negotiations about health issues and policies that directly affect them. Although democracy as practiced within the UN is far from absolute, and the richest and most powerful northern nations structure the system and exercise unequal powers within it, the fact that countries from both North and South, both rich and poor nations, were in principle included in the decision-making arena represented a major change from the colonial world that had generated tropical medicine, and at some level can be understood as the defining criterion of the new international health system. Geopolitical power struggles continued to mark the world of international health, albeit in a very different form from that of colonial or tropical medicine, with the impact of the Cold War and the tensions between the US and Soviet spheres of influence playing the greatest role over the period running from the 1950s to the 1980s. But it was at least possible to articulate greater inclusivity as an ethical and political principle linked to a notion of justice. And this was perhaps most concretely symbolized in a number of developments. For example, the WHO and UNICEF-sponsored Alma Ata Conference on Primary Health Care, held in 1978, and its declaration of health for all by the year 2000. In specific countries, the concern with health for all was also expressed in response to specific local circumstances. In Brazil and other key Latin American countries, for example, the sanitary reform and collective health movements played key roles in resistance to military authoritarian dictatorships, providing support for redemocratization processes in the late 1970s and across the 1980s. This period in international health also witnessed the struggle for a gradual paradigm shift from population control to reproductive health and reproductive rights. Championed by the international women's movement. Could you advance the slides, please? Nope, I'm actually too far ahead of myself. Go back 2, please. One more. One more. Okay, that's where I wanted to be. So in the period of international health also witnessed the struggle for a gradual paradigm shift from population control to reproductive health and rights, championed by the international women's movements and its allies, from the mid-1980s to the early 1990s. And the global mobilization against HIV and AIDS led first and foremost by affected communities and populations in the face of unabashed stigma and discrimination, and gradually, albeit belatedly, taken up by the WHO, also in the mid-1980s to the early 1990s. Next slide, please. In Brazil, the sanitary reform movement and AIDS activists also joined forces in the late 1980s to mobilize against the commercialization of blood and blood products, articulating to include this provision together with a firm commitment to the right to health in the new democratic constitution of 1988. Together, such developments fed into an increasingly articulate understanding of health and human rights as the defining ethical, political framework of the international health era. While all these developments faced resistance, often in the name of cost-effectiveness, in some instances from powerful countries like the USA and supranational institutions like the World Bank, over the course of the 1980s and the early 1990s, gradual advances took place in the direction of greater inclusion and justice. Next slide, please. This consolidation was closely tied to the transnational social movements that were beginning to organize at the time, linking human rights to social justice on the part of what some would describe as a kind of rainbow coalition, movements including feminism and the women's health and rights movement, LGBTQI rights, civil rights and anti-racist movements, ecological and environmental justice movements, movements of poor and marginalized populations, and so on. If the geopolitical shift announced by the end of the Second World War was central for ushering in the new era of international health, the end of the Cold War at the end of the 1980s, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening up of the era of post-Cold War possibilities, combined with increasingly intense processes of globalization and transformations in the global capitalist system over the course of the 1990s, as international health gradually began to be reconceived as global health. Next slide, please. The transition to global health was marked from the very beginning by fundamental conflicts and tensions that have yet to be resolved. On the one hand, the financial and political interests of the rapidly expanding, globalized neoliberal capitalist system, and on the other, the struggle for access to health for all, based on ethical and political principles of human rights and social justice. These conflicts and tensions would be reproduced as well in the fundamental tension between North and South, understood not just geographically, but also socially and economically, in terms of poverty and social and economic exclusions of the South within the North, in pockets of poverty and the black holes of informational capitalism. The struggle for access to medicines, that is one of the key issues that will be examined at this meeting, was at the heart of these conflicts, and it exploded precisely at the moment of the transition to global health. In 1996, when for the first time news of effective antiretroviral treatments for HIV infection was announced at the 11th International Conference on AIDS in Vancouver, Canada. Next slide, please. After 15 years of fighting a deadly global pandemic with no effective treatment, this news was overwhelming. But it was also almost immediately obvious to all of us at that conference that because of the high cost of these new medications, almost no one living in poor countries or in poor communities in rich countries would have access to them. In a matter of just days before the end of the conference, the reasonably well-organized Brazilian coalition of activists, scientists, and program staff attending in Vancouver had staged demonstrations in the pharmaceutical industry display booth area to protest the cost of the new medications and the politics of exclusion. And in less than 6 months following the conference, had successfully organized a campaign and built a bipartisan alliance to pass legislation guaranteeing legal access to antiretroviral treatments for all who need them in Brazil through SUS, Brazil's unified health system. Successful implementation of this universal access policy depended on key conditions not available in many other locations, such as the existence of Brazilian businesses capable of producing generic medications, including the existence of state-owned pharmaceutical R&D and manufacturing capacity through Fiocruz, an institution that some of you will be visiting while here in Brazil, as well as the existence of SUS to distribute these locally produced medications. Its continued success over nearly 3 decades now also depended on ongoing watchdog and advocacy initiatives of civil society groups like GTPI, the Working Group on Intellectual Property, carried out over more than 20 years now. But while it would be an ongoing process, Brazil's universal access policy was a spark helping to light a movement that would spread around Latin America, as well as to other parts of Africa and Asia and around the world, linking activists and allies, both north and south, and stimulating a global debate about health justice and treatment access that would dominate the next 5 years, leading up to the 2001 UN General Assembly Special Session on HIV and AIDS in New York City. Next slide, please. Over this period, the single largest shift ever seen in worldwide health policy would take place, with activists and their allies overturning the almost complete consensus that treatment was too expensive to be possible for all but a privileged few, and reconceiving access as a moral and ethical obligation, a fundamental issue of justice for all. Next slide, please. Led by countries from the global south, it would also result in successful negotiations within the World Trade Organization in the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement in Public Health, adopted at the WTO Ministerial Conference in November of 2001, permitting countries to declare public health emergencies and make use of TRIPS flexibilities, such as compulsory licensing, to address these emergencies. This victory would unleash the HIV scale-up era, but also the boom in the growth of the neoliberal global health industry over the course of the 2000s and the 2010s. A fundamental tension that is still with us today would emerge over this period of scale-up and consolidation of the global health industry. On the one hand, the field of global health would be marked by an ongoing struggle on the part of health justice advocates, and occasionally some progressive governments, to defend and expand understandings of health and human rights through policies and programs aimed at inclusion and access. Next slide, please. If this struggle that had motivated many of the most important activists and advocacy campaigns and actors in the field of global health, groups like the People's Health Movement, founded in 2000 to mark the date of the original Health for All Declaration, which has become a key contributor through its Global Health Watch reports, monitoring the WHO, and a range of global health governance policies. But it also motivates the work of many other organizations, many of whom are co-organizers of this present meeting or are present here over the course of the next week. The Third World Network, the South Center, Dawn, MSF, Health Gap, the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition, currently led by my fellow speaker, Solange Baptiste, and too many others to be able to list them all here, but who together constitute a broad front of allies working for health justice globally. But as the field of global health exploded over the 2000s and the 2010s, on the other hand, another cast of characters evolved, what I tend to think of as the global health establishment, that is far more powerful and influential, and that include technical experts and management consultants, the global health governance agencies, the administrators who call the shots and run the show, and the industries that make their profits through the commodification of health and illness. Next slide, please. I'm thinking here currently of the representatives of the private sector, of the philanthropic institutions, and especially the philanthrocapitalists, and the majority of northern country governments who maintain control over programs and policies through large-scale northern-dominated global health initiatives, or GHIs, public-private partnerships, or PPPs, and similar other mechanisms in ways that make the global health assemblage work without jeopardizing northern control and without attenuating industry profits. Some of these actors, like the majority of the big pharma companies, were created in the earlier phases of health worldwide. But many other actors have evolved specifically since the period of global health began. Just like the People's Health Movement on our side of the battlefield, for example, both GlaxoSmithKline and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation were also founded in the year 2000. And they have been joined by similar other actors like the Gavi Alliance, the Global Fund, PEPFAR, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, the Merck Global Health Institute, and countless others who make up the global health assemblage. While this global health operation has been very effective at selling itself, often with false advertising. Just think of the promises of the imminent end of AIDS that it began to roll out starting roughly in 2010 or 2011, not coincidentally just after the beginning of the Great Recession resulting from the 2007-2008 financial crisis. It has been considerably less effective, however, at truly contributing for health for all, even though it claims to be doing exactly that. While the battle lines that separate the health justice movement from the global health industry seem relatively clear, it is far less evident precisely how both sides of this struggle have been impacted by the extensive political and economic crises that have emerged over the past decade. The crisis in capitalism, the crisis in neoliberalism, the ruptures in liberal democracy, the effects of remilitarization, the climate crisis, and of course, the crisis in global health itself, resulting from the emergence of the COVID pandemic in 2000. Next slide, please. Nowhere were these tensions and conflicts that characterize the contemporary field of global health more evident than in the years since the beginning of COVID-19, in the denial and negation that marked initial policy responses to the pandemic, the irrational rationales, the strategic ignorance that it produced, the stigma and discrimination that it generated, the stockpiling and hoarding of vaccines on the part of countries from the global north, and the vaccine apartheid that the current global health system quickly produced. Just as the global health establishment declared HIV and AIDS effectively over, even though millions of people living with HIV still have no access to treatment, today it increasingly claims that the COVID pandemic is over and denies the collective failure that vaccine apartheid made so clearly visible. The struggle against health injustice, therefore, has been long and hard. We've achieved some important victories along the way, but the road ahead in seeking to defend health justice, like the road that might one day lead to climate justice, suggests that it will be an exceptionally difficult journey. The conclusion should not be understood to suggest that there are no windows of opportunity. Next slide, please, that we might be able to open. On the contrary, there are important windows of opportunity. There are important possibilities that hopefully we'll be able to discuss over the course of this meeting together, some of which I've tried to list on this slide, and they're very different types that I don't have time to discuss in detail, but that I'm sure we'll be discussing over the next few days. But it's precisely because these challenges are great that a meeting like this one that we're participating in this week here in Rio de Janeiro is so crucially important. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, which was a actual real lesson. And I think I would just like to highlight how you weaved in, right? You talked about global health, but bringing also in priority and highlighting social movements history. And I think it just makes sense of why we are here and how intersectionality, interdisciplinary approach and solidarity are weapons, are historical weapons that have been crucial as the points that Richard highlighted and are crucial for our struggle together. So thank you. I won't. So I would like to give the floor to Solange Baptiste from the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition.
Does this work? Can I just check? Because I have many little things to click. All right. Thank you very much, Richard, for your presentation and for that sort of historical view. It's an amazing thing to look back on how far we've come and how far we still have to go. My name is Solange Baptiste, and I'm working with ITPC, and I made up a title for this presentation after trying to figure out what do I say after Richard and how do I connect health and climate. And then offer someone from a climate perspective to speak. So I'm talking about navigating our complex global context. And I'm going to talk about it from a health perspective, a financing perspective, and a community perspective. Well, I'll try. ITPC was started, in case people do not really know ITPC, it was started 20 years ago. So today, this 2023 is our 20-year anniversary in this fight. So we're really excited to be present, and thank you for inviting us to this meeting. I'm going to try to advance for myself. The question is, where do I point this? Is anybody in the back there watching me? Do I point? You see? You can't. So I think I have to point here. Do I point to you? Where do I point? There. All right, we'll try, and then we'll see. So I often start with my best jokes because all my slides are depressing. So my first joke is the E in South Africa stands for electricity. There is no E if you are lost. I know you're thinking in Spanish and Portuguese, but South Africa does not have an E. So the point is, we are struggling with a lot of power outages, and my friends from South Africa here all have an app that tells us when power is going to go, how long it's going to go for. And on the right side, this guy is saying, "Will you marry me?" And he's supposedly giving something very expensive, and he's giving her petrol, fuel for the car. And she's so excited and thinks it's beautiful. So it's just a reflection on the state of the world. We have some wider context, which is quite scary. In March 10, I want to harken back to the opening presentation that talked about the swing of power to the east, and also what is BRICS? Are the BRICS still the BRICS? So on March 10, we have now China brokering deals as the moral sort of broker in the middle of Iran and Saudi Arabia. And then on March 15, so 4 days after, you now have the front of the news being UK, US, and Australia agreeing on nuclear submarine projects. I remember Biden saying specifically it's not that they're carrying nuclear weapons, but it's powered by nuclear power, and he wanted to be clear about that. And then the very next day, you have Putin and China discussing plans to end the war. So it's the front page of the news is kind of swinging, and you see the arc and the powers that be trying to control. And this is all in the context of crazy things happening in the climate sector. So we have flooding, we have monkeypox. On the right, it's a picture trying to show the contrast in South Africa with, poverty and extreme rich people and nutrition crises. The earth is dying, as in the soil is no longer productive, and so you have all these nutrition issues. I'm clicking. See what is happening? You cannot do that to me, guys. You have to go back. You're going to mess up all my jokes. All right, so this is the slide on the COVID-19 vaccine apartheid. I think we have the person who gave it that name in this room. And I think it's vaccine apartheid by design. And on the right side, it's also sort of a thing I have with my children. They were able, these are my kids on the right, they were able to get a vaccine. They're both under 12. But they could not get it in South Africa, even though I live in South Africa for 6 years. So on my way to the AIDS conference, I took them with me, and they got vaccinated in a CVS for free in the United States. That's because I have the privilege of having 3 passports. And so I come from Trinidad, but I live in South Africa, but they have the access to things that others don't have in the United States. And that's reflected in the macro scale on this picture here, which obviously now my eyes can't read, but it's the, oh dear, COVID vaccine by World Bank income group. And so the high income guys are on the left and the low income guys are on the right. So the poorer you are, the less access you have. I mean, you all know these points. I'm trying to click. So the progress that we have here is insufficient and threatened. If you look at TB deaths, they're starting to increase. Malaria mortality rate is also on the incline. And then HIV deaths going down, but nowhere near the targets that we have set for ourselves in 2025 and 2030. And then these things are also threatened by other issues like climate change and global conflict. All right, so there are significant macroeconomic threats. As I said, my slides only get more and more depressing. I think I'm gonna have to open my computer because I genuinely cannot see all the words, but that's okay, I have it pulled up. So the significant macroeconomic threats here, including rising debt, stress. So when you thought your country was able to buy a certain amount of commodities, it can't anymore because we are in debt and you have less money, so you have $1 to stretch. Surging food insecurity in prices, revisions to expected growth, and reduction in government spending. I'll just go on to the next one. And then just a quick snapshot of the 3 main diseases that we get obsessed with. So TB. The world is not on track to meet the SDG targets, but there's this global plan that shows that it's still possible to end TB. So that green line is the one that you're tracking, which is the global plan. You see how much has to happen to bend that curve down. And if you look at where we are in trajectory, you'll see that purple line going across. So how good is that? So the next slide is now, can you please go back to the slide with the guy's face? Back. We're in TB, yes. So the TB has a huge financing gap. This is the guy from Schitt's Creek. But he's screaming internally because if you look here, it's a lot of words and you all will have access to the slides and you can read through the detail. But in terms of the financing required for that global plan that will get us down, the red bar is the amount available in terms of funding. So if you only look at that graph, you're talking about TB care and prevention, R&D and new tools, and vaccination. There isn't even a red bar in vaccination. The red bar is the amount available. So there's a huge financing gap for TB. And you think about what happened post-COVID and how bad the situation is. Next slide. So looking at malaria, next. Next, or am I doing it? See, this is what, there we go. So here we're looking at the comparison of global progress on malaria, so case incidence. Again, trajectory is the light blue, and where we need to get is the green, so bad stuff. Next slide, I think I did it, okay. And here is around mortality rate considering the 2 scenarios, so the current trajectory and the global targets achieved. And this is from the WHO. And then the malaria financing landscape, I think I can do it. Here, if there's a lot of information, on the left is funding for malaria control and elimination by channels. So you're looking like who is funding, so governments, Global Fund, UK government, World Bank, etc. And on the right, if you focus here on the bottom, it says in the blue, is incremental. When you think of incremental, you think of small bits going up, but look at those increments. The incremental funding needed to increase intervention coverage from current levels to 90% by 2030. And the orange is funding needed to sustain our intervention coverage. So that is a huge need that needs to be achieved for malaria. And I wouldn't get into the issues of resistance because all our mosquitoes are now finding new ways to live despite all the spraying. HIV, next slide. Oh, Lord, let's go back, please. What is happening? Is it that can you please go back? All right. We are in HIV? Yes, we are in HIV. So this is AIDS by numbers. We're looking at, obviously everybody in this room is not unaware that HIV, AIDS is still a problem in terms of people who are newly infected, people living with HIV, and people dying of AIDS-related illnesses in 2021. And our funding landscape is no prettier either. So this is HIV data from the World Health Organization, looking at our progress to the 1990, but 1995, 95, the 395s now. So the gray, the dark gray area is the 95, 95, 95 target. That's where we need to get, and we're looking now at the percentage of people who are there by the cascade, which is knowing your status, on ART, and then green is viral suppression. The leftmost column is the global. I know the contrast here is not very good. So the leftmost column is just a global aggregate. You would see here that Western Pacific region is doing pretty well. The East Mediterranean region doing poorly. West and Central Africa doing poorly. And you can look through these slides further on. And then the financial landscape. Did I do it? I didn't do it. I think I did it. Okay. Financial landscape. Again, lots of information, but the blue is what is needed. So if you look on the right side, this is current resources and estimated need by region and programmatic intervention. So we're here looking at the Caribbean, look at Latin America, which is on the second from the right, Latin America bars. And then here, looking at it by the program area, so testing and treatment, prevention. Look at primary prevention. The need always is outpacing what is the resources that are available. So my next slide. So this is a question so that you all are not sleeping. Is this true or false? So who thinks it's true? Hypertension kills more people than any other condition. Who thinks that's true? If it's true, please put your hand up. This is a trick, right? It's not a trick, it's a question. Is Dietrich here, Othman? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So few people who thinks it's false. Who refuses to vote. That's not what's happening. All right, let's see. Well, the answer is true. Next, I'll see. Oh, Lord, guys, help me. Get to the next question, which is slide 20, please. We're going backwards. All right, so that was my question. Let me see if I can do it. All right. Hypertension kills more people than all infectious diseases combined. Now you saw my slide, so you know the answer. It's true. So, in case we were forgetting about non-communicable diseases, hypertension is the leading risk factor for preventable deaths worldwide. I hope everybody here knows their blood pressure. You should know it. If you don't, you should figure it out. It kills more than any other condition and more than all infectious diseases combined. I had to triple check this data because I was like, there's no way, right? But it's because heart disease, ischemic heart disease is normally the #1 killer of people. That's why hypertension is sitting there. Right, so again, I can go through all of this. 41 million deaths. They expect it to rise to 52 million in NCDs, and that's an aggregate. It's usually between people of 30 to 70 years old. It occurs in lower middle and middle income countries, and many of these issues can be prevented, right? And this you cannot see, but you could have seen on my slide. 5 leading NCDs estimated to cost 47 trillion between 2010 to 2030, and on an average more than 2 trillion per year. Out-of-pocket payments for health expenses push an estimated of 100 million people into extreme poverty. So think of when your insurance cannot pay for it, and you have to go now and pay out of pocket. You get your whole community to try to pay. And this is just a quote here, says that it will also threaten health, where is it? It will also threaten health, security, and preparedness of countries to respond to future pandemics and health threats. Next slide, I think I'm doing it. What is this? And don't say a mosquito. Because clearly I'm in Latin America. If I went somewhere else, they wouldn't know what this is. So to be honest, because I grew up in Trinidad, we had white walls. You're supposed to have white walls because you need to kill the mosquito. And then as a typical Trinidadian child, I would pick the mosquito up and check for the spots on the legs to see if this mosquito was trying to give me malaria while I was sleeping. So this is the culprit, the Aedes aegypti mosquito. But this story is not about Trinidad, it's about Argentina. Just 2-3 days ago, in April 22nd, Argentina had a dengue breakout, and it killed over 40 people. It was about 60,000 people who were infected, and the mosquitoes there, they say here, this mosquito, due to the rise in temperature in our country and the world, is able to spread more. So I'm trying to now get the link between climate and health, and you see here the Ministry of Health has urged people to step up these anti-mosquito measures, including the netting in doorways and windows. All right, I'm almost done. What do all these pictures have in common? The nets. Those are people using malaria mosquito nets for weddings and for fishing. So again, nobody invests in health education, treatment literacy across diseases. And now you have sprayed nets going to collect fish in the ocean and also for our brides. So just think about what's happening to the climate and to the ocean. And then I will speed through the rest of my slides. So we have devastating floods in Pakistan in 2022. I think we could all remember that. So, but Pakistan is not only drowning in water, it's also drowning in debt if you look at what their projections are. We have extreme heat conditions in parts of India at 40 to 42 degrees Celsius. I don't know if any of you have experienced that. But now they had to change the school hours to start earlier because children were actually getting heat stroke and couldn't learn. So it's now from 7 to noon. And there's this inextricable link between heat stress and maternal and child health. So you have mothers who are pregnant or neonates that are now born in this very extreme hot climate. And I love this quote. It says, "The effects of climate change begin in the womb." And just looking at women here who are commuting through floods in very hot conditions. We had Cyclone Freddy, which then led us to a cholera outbreak. We have even some warnings in South Africa saying, please be careful with the water. And then I move into climate. This is COP27. Is anyone missing? So if you could see better, I tried to highlight the 2 women I could find. It's just a bunch of men trying to tell us how to fix the climate. And then here, again, you may not be able to read, but it's about here. This guy is from Grenada, and he is from the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and he was addressing participants, and he says, it's about hearing your interests, you, the most affected and least responsible for the climate crisis. And I think this is really, the tweet on the right side is about farmers, and they were not being able to get their voices amplified in COP27 because of just being drowned out by the bigger players in the field. But I think it's a really good slide to help us kind of settle ourselves on the actual issues of the ones that are most affected are not always the ones who are heard, and also this conflict in the climate space between reparations. Why should we contribute? You are the one that did the pollution, you should fix it, but then we are all on this earth together. So to what extent should we also help to fix it? So I think it's an interesting debate that we could think about. Next slide here is just, again, the complex global context. This is from the World Economic Forum. This is the Global Risks Report for 2023. It's quite depressing if you want something sad to read. But this was a key risks over the next 2 and then 10 years ranked by severity for political leaders. And you'll see in the top, on the 2 years, the top 3 points there: cost of living crisis in the next 2 years, natural disasters and extreme weather events, and geoeconomic confrontation. And then that's a whole new term, right? And then the next is the 10 years, failure to mitigate climate change, failure of climate change adaptation, and natural disasters and extreme weather events. So if we wanted to ignore climate, It will not ignore us. Okay? The next slide, I'm going to quickly go. I thought this was interesting to watch. The slide is from the Global Fund. All the elections that are coming up in key countries that are donor countries, and looking at the extreme political fragility, volatility that's happening. Where you think, yes, we have stability, this government will always contribute to the Global Fund, etc. We have elections that are coming up. I don't know, when is the next election in Brazil? I know your elections were very fun. Yes, in the next 4 years. So, but replenishment for the Global Fund, for example, is in 2025. So there's a lot of concern around what's going to happen in the political landscape. And then the top threats to 2025. I don't know what's happening here, guys. Go back. Let me do it if I'm doing it. I think I've done it. Right, top threats to 2025, cost of living crisis, economic downturn, economic warfare, climate action hiatus, and societal polarization. I think we can all accept that. And I thought this was interesting, recession probabilities worldwide. You see the top there, the countries, the BRICS countries are on the low end. And the usual suspects that we thought were always stable and always going to have money is the UK, New Zealand, and all of that on the right side here. And we have India with the lowest probability of recession. So interesting to think where the world is heading. And so it's on the backdrop of all of this that we have this, right? We have complete unrest. People are no longer just accepting anything. We have protests in Brazil. We moved to Mexico, what's happening in Khartoum in Sudan, and then recently in Sri Lanka. You will see better when you get the slides. I am almost done. So this is all linked to the SDGs. Obviously, this is what unifies us here. Does anybody know the answer to this? What is the financing gap per year for reaching the SDGs? Yes, and don't tell me in real, tell me in US dollars, please. Nobody knows? It's 2.5 trillion. So and that's per year. We are nowhere near reaching the SDGs. And so the problem of financing global public goods is extreme. We have issues in health, climate change, digital transformation, humanitarian crises, and social security systems. You can learn more from the slides. This here is the unsustainable donor-recipient dynamic. If we're thinking about how much we expect donor countries to give us, so for the ACTE, for CEPI, for Global Fund, all of this money comes in, but we expect it to come in from high-income countries only. If you look at the bottom here, the non-high-income countries, the UMICs, the LMICs, and the lower-income countries do not contribute to these things at all. And so my question is, will we accept a begging bowl model for financing our global public architecture? That's the question I want to challenge us to discuss. Will we accept that we will always be recipient countries and that we will always need to ask donors for money? And is that the future? And it's in that context I wanted to just say, this is a lot of data and I will wrap up. This is the question I wanted to ask here, or just to show you that small amounts, this is a study done by CEPI, small amounts from non-high income countries can make a big difference. But that is only able if we do it in the context of global public investment. And there was a recently launched network, Global Public Investment Network, or GPIN, where all contribute, all decide, and all benefit. We can talk more about that if needed later on. Many of the membership is sitting in this room on the left side. There's a steering committee. They're now getting a network coordinator. So we're in this poly crisis. We could either run away or organize and fight. You cannot see my ostrich because the contrast is so sad, but it is critical to acknowledge and keep up with the changing environment. This is my second to last slide. It says unifying principles here. I think community leadership is key. Voice of affected communities in the context of a robust civil society is vital. Communities most affected by an issue should have a robust voice and be equipped to influence decisions that affect them. Communities contribute to data and solutions to common issues. And the slide is gone. And I will continue reading. And communities cannot be ignored. There's a threat of unrest. There's also resilience and genuine sustainability. This question we always get, how are you going to sustain? Well, if you invest in the people, the systems, the countries, and the global architecture. And this is my last slide here. This is, I don't know if anybody's been paying attention in Brazil. This is Alessandra. She has won just yesterday the 2023 Goldman Environmental Prize. And she says, against Anglo American, which is the mining company that was trying to take space in the Amazon, she says, Anglo American, may be powerful to you, but to me, the powerful ones are the river, the strength of our territory and our people, the ant doing its work, and the resistance of our people for more than 500 years in the fight for our land. And it just what she said, victories are built on bringing the entire community together. Thank you.
Is it working? Yeah. Thanks so much, Solange, for painting this grateful picture. Basically, as a very respectful doctor from Argentina, Dr. Damian Versenasi says, this is the geopolitics of illness. And we have a huge agenda, a common agenda to turn this geopolitics of illness into a geopolitics of health. So we have to think about ensuring access to medicines for specific cause, and also about influencing global climate policies. So I'll turn over to Francisco to provide a few comments on maybe what do we have to think about when communicating about this huge issue.
Thank you, Milena. Voy a hablar en español si es que no es problema, aunque pido disculpas a los colegas traductores por mi español chileno, que tiene la fama bien merecida de no ser muy bueno. Primero me presento, mi nombre es Francisco Parra, yo soy director ejecutivo de Climate Tracker América Latina. Somos una ONG que se dedica a promover el periodismo ambiental y climático en todo el mundo. Climate Tracker nació a eso del 2015 en el contexto del Acuerdo de París, con la idea de que las discusiones que se daban en ese tipo... I think it's not... I can turn to English if it is okay. ¿Funciona ahora? Sí. Hola. Bueno, hablo normal. Les estaba contando de que Climate Tracker nace para el Acuerdo de París y me dicen si funciona la traducción ahora al inglés. ¿Sí? Está funcionando. Perfecto. Muchas gracias. Y nace con la idea de que las discusiones que estaban ocurriendo en esos espacios de diplomacia internacional tenían que llegar a las comunidades, tenían que llegar a los territorios. Por eso la organización tiene el ímpetu de que en esos espacios hayan periodistas, hayan comunicadores de América Latina, de África y de Asia, que con sus propios bagajes culturales, con sus propias historias, puedan contar para su propia audiencia, su ciudadanía, la gente de sus países, qué es lo que estaba pasando. Y trabajamos en torno a las temáticas periodísticas, narrativas periodísticas, en torno al cambio climático y para esta oportunidad, que bueno, agradezco mucho el honor de poder compartir panel con Richard y con Solange, se me pidió comentar acerca de esta interconexión entre salud y clima y muy relacionado a lo último que comentaba Solange, de estas personas, las más afectadas pero las menos responsables. Mi mente viajó inmediatamente a una pequeña localidad en Chile que se llama Quintero. Está en la costa, a eso de 1 hora y media de Santiago, y viajó inmediatamente al recuerdo del caso de Anaís. Anaís es una niña que yo conocí hace unos años, que tiene 11 años, y vive ahí en Quintero, y ella tiene asma crónico. Con cierta regularidad, que es bastante terrible, ella sufre de dolores de cabeza, sangramiento, problemas para respirar. Ella no sale de su casa, estudia dentro de la casa en una modalidad en Chile que se llaman exámenes libres. No asiste a la escuela, es decir, cada vez que lo hacía exponía su salud, entonces su familia decidió no llevarla más. Visitaron especialistas en Santiago, en Valparaíso, y una vez un doctor le dijo a su madre que lo mejor que ellos podían hacer para la salud de su hija era mudarse de ciudad. ¿Por qué? Porque Anaís vive en Quintero, que es lo que en Chile llaman una zona de sacrificio, que ya de por sí es terrible el nombre, un lugar determinado para el sacrificio. La bahía de Quintero y Puchuncaví, que está en la costa, tiene un complejo industrial desde hace medio siglo, 50 años, de más de 20 industrias, termoeléctricas de carbón, de gas, hay una refinería minera de cobre, una refinería de petróleo, etc. Y Anaís, que fue el caso que yo pude conocer, es solo una de 1.553 niños, niñas y adolescentes que terminaron visitando los servicios de urgencia de la región de Valparaíso entre agosto y octubre de 2019. Solo entre esos 3 meses, más de 1.500 casos de intoxicación solo en niños, niñas y adolescentes. Se detuvieron las clases, se suspendieron las clases, se detuvieron los colegios. Obviamente la situación causó revuelo, o sea, se acordarán tal vez, bueno, Milena, que es de Chile, no sé si hay alguien más de allá, que copó los noticiarios. Pasó hubo mucho choque en Chile en ese momento. Incluso la Corte Suprema, unos meses después, llegó a determinar que el Estado y las empresas fallaron en contra de afectar a la salud de las personas. La Corte falló en contra del Estado y de las empresas para poder remediarlo. La situación lamentablemente no se ha solucionado hasta ahora. Entonces, en esta pregunta, la interconexión entre justicia climática y justicia de salud es, con esa experiencia de ese caso, para mí reflejaban que es lo mismo. O sea, hablamos tal vez desde el tema ambiental en Chile, en el cierre de las termoeléctricas de carbón, en una presión que existe hacia específicamente a Esgener, que es la dueña de las 4 termoeléctricas que existen ahí en la bahía de Quintero, para que ponga una fecha de cierre para sus termoeléctricas de carbón, cosa que todavía no pasa porque son acuerdos voluntarios. Y mientras, hace menos de 2 semanas, la misma Esgener superó el límite legal de emisiones de dióxido de azufre, mientras piensan que se va a cerrar y mientras personas como Anaís y muchas familias más siguen sufriendo las consecuencias de vivir ahí. Y de nuevo, los menos responsables, los que más sufren también. El caso creo que refleja lo que pasa en muchos lugares alrededor del mundo con quienes están expuestos a la contaminación producto de los combustibles fósiles. Quiero dar me avisa si me queda poquito tiempo, pero quería dar un poco también una reflexión desde el lugar que a mí me toca trabajar, que es desde el periodismo y desde las comunicaciones. Nosotros en 2021 quisimos conocer cómo los medios de comunicación en 6 países de Latinoamérica, Argentina, Chile, Brasil, Colombia, México y República Dominicana, comunicaban acerca de la transición energética. Queríamos saber cuál es el mensaje que estaban entregando, cuál era el mensaje que le estaba llegando a la gente, lo que en el periodismo se le conoce como el foco, el enfoque, y que es en términos prácticos los lentes que un periodista se pone para comunicar un tema. Lo que analizamos más de 1.000 piezas, 1.000 productos periodísticos que se publicaron en el periodo de un año, solo de transición energética, solo de energía. Entre las conclusiones que obtuvimos está algo que no fue mucho una sorpresa, era que el principal foco es económico, o sea, particularmente negocios. Desde ahí es donde se ve la transición energética, es el principal mensaje que se transmite. Pero algo que nosotros quisimos ver era si es que la salud pública era un foco a la hora de comunicar la transición energética. Porque sabíamos que existían casos como el de Quintero y existen múltiples casos más, contaminantes climáticos de vida corta, metano, carbono negro, etcétera, que hay muchas interconexiones ahí para quien se quiere indagar más en el tema. Solo encontramos de las más de 1.200 piezas que analizamos un 0,5% de los artículos que incorporó la perspectiva de salud en la temática de energía. Para mí eso refleja obviamente una inmensa brecha en lo que hay que hacer, una inmensa responsabilidad, partiendo por la responsabilidad que tenemos nosotros los periodistas a la hora de comunicar, de diversificar enfoques, de diversificar fuentes, porque a propósito también lo que comentó Solange, de que los hombres en la imagen de la COP, encontramos que el 80% de las fuentes utilizadas en los medios eran hombres. O sea, por cada mujer que se le consulta como voz experta, hay 4 hombres. Hay obviamente una responsabilidad que trabajar ahí, pero lo que creo que este tipo de trabajo refleja y creo que es una invitación tal vez para todos los que están acá, es que la narrativa, la agenda de la justicia climática está alineada con la agenda de la justicia por salud. No solo en el caso que yo les contaba, que es el caso de Anaís, y aquí un breve comentario con la exposición de Richard, o sea, es prácticamente en la genealogía, que estuvo muy interesante de este movimiento del Health Justice, es casi imposible no hacer paralelismos con la historia del movimiento ambiental, desde la historia colonial, desde esto que parte como relacionado al interés geopolítico, la necesidad de vincularlos con los derechos humanos, una agenda más progresista impulsada desde el sur global y la demanda de accountability. Cada una de esas cosas está en el corazón también del movimiento por la justicia climática. Entonces, yo creo que lo que le quiero decir es que la invitación un poco y lo que yo veo es que la conexión, la integralidad de relato o una agenda política coordinada entre el movimiento de salud y climática es algo que puede cerrar esa brecha, que nosotros la vimos en los medios de comunicación. O sea, y hoy sabemos que no todo el mundo se informa a través de los medios de comunicación, pero por lo menos una parte importante sigue haciéndolo. Pero ese es el tipo de cosas que creo que puede ayudar a cerrar. Eso como comentario. Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Gracias, Francisco. I'm going to speak in English, sorry. Thank you, Francisco. We don't have so much time, so I'll jump to the questions. So those of you who are in the audience who would like to ask or make an intervention, a comment, they are mostly welcome right now.
Bueno, muchas gracias por las exposiciones. La verdad que es un placer escucharlo y un dolor también. Para Richard, una pregunta. Si tenés identificado los factores que hicieron y hacen que la agenda de justicia sanitaria esté tan escindida de la agenda de justicia climática, hídrica y ambiental. Y una consideración, a la narrativa, digamos, de la historia de salud global le incorporaría la sangre, el saqueo, la desposesión y sobre todo la relación con las dictaduras militares, ¿no? En Latinoamérica, la primera dictadura de Argentina en el 30 fue justamente por una ley de medicamentos. Entonces tiene sangre atrás la historia de Argentina. Así que gracias, muchísimas gracias.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say, Richard, I really liked the historic background that you gave. You cannot hear me. I was saying, Richard, I really appreciated the background that you gave. I think many of us forget the movement and where we came from, and it helps us to also place ourselves and also determine if we've progressed in any way. So really appreciate that, and I would love to have a copy of your slides. There are just a few things that I haven't heard, and I don't know if it's maybe today's Latin America Day, but there's a few things that I haven't heard from the African perspective. when we talk about, for example, many of the countries in Latin America are much more developed than our countries back home. So in Africa, 23 out of the 27 least developed nations are in Africa. That is almost 50% of our countries, 40 some odd percent, who are least developed nations. And then among those, there are almost 50% that don't have access to care. So when we talk about a political movement or a movement around access issues, I think it's really important to also understand that when we look at the continuum, and even some of those slides that you were showing, when we look at the continuum, most of those countries are in the global south, in Africa primarily, that are really falling behind. So how do we mobilize political will? How do we support governments? Those funding structures, the global health initiatives, the Gavis, the CEPIs, the World Banks, etc., they are very much vertical funders. So our health systems are never strengthened appropriately to be able to even work on some of those other key issues. So I wonder if we can begin to also think about this in terms of our activism. How do we look at global funding agencies? How do we make them accountable, not just to fund verticals, but actually to look at country needs and priorities and incorporate that as part of also building that health system? Because I think that's one of the things that we do. So when we talk about malaria, when we talk about HIV, when we talk about, even in climate, it's just now that health people are realizing that climate is an issue that they need to be involved in. If you went to COP27, it was very much, separated. They don't even understand the politics of it. So how do we get health even in the climate discussion? How do we get us to COP28? For those of you who were at 27, you saw it, but in 28, we need to be far more effective. So I just wonder how we're looking at that, and in terms of our continent in Africa, how do we support the ministries of health to get their voices amplified? What are some of the things that you're doing within your organizations? Sorry, I didn't mean for it to be that long, but it's what it is.
Oi, posso? Assim, obrigada. Eu queria agradecer as três apresentações. Eu me senti provocada pela fala do companheiro chileno. Eu trabalho numa organização humanitária de saúde e para nós é tão evidente as consequências da mudança climática na saúde. É a mesma coisa. A sua fala me provoca a dizer que a crise climática é uma crise de saúde. Não há para mim, não é que há um paralelo. Ela é em si uma crise de saúde. E quando eu penso nos fatores que envolvem esses dois elos, assim, que a gente tende a colocar em caixas diferentes, tem as empresas no centro, tem o estilo de vida dos ricos e dos pobres no centro, tem as decisões políticas baseadas nos laços com as empresas. É a mesma coisa, né? A gente trabalhando hoje com população indígena Yanomami, vítima de garimpo, é a mesma coisa. E aí eu fico me desafiando a pensar junto com vocês, e aí eu devolvo para os três, como é que a gente simplifica os nossos argumentos para a gente parar de achar que somos dois movimentos. Não somos. A gente precisa parar de falar isso, na minha avaliação. E a gente precisa somar as nossas forças, inclusive tentando simplificar a nossa mensagem para o público em geral, numa sociedade super polarizada. E é óbvio que, como aconteceu com o movimento de acesso a medicamentos, a gente precisa ter os técnicos que vão trabalhar na parte hard do negócio. Eu sou advogada de propriedade industrial. Foi assim que eu cheguei nesse mundo aqui. A gente precisa dos grandes especialistas que vão ser fera nas negociações e vão entender de mitigação e vão entender dos temas duros do debate. Mas isso não pode nos afastar das pessoas. Isso tem que ser um jogo para dentro, o jogo para fora tem que ser o jogo da saúde, gente. É o jogo que as pessoas entendem. Pela primeira vez na América Latina, depois da Covid, a preocupação da população é saúde. Sempre foi violência.
sempre foi violência. Então, a gente tem que, não sei, a minha avaliação é que a gente tem que pegar essa avenida e parar de achar que somos dois movimentos. Essa é a minha impressão. Queria ouvir vocês um pouco sobre isso.
We are just going to collect these 3 questions and comments, and then let the speakers respond, and then go back to the audience. Okay? Would you like to go, Richard, or Solange?
I'm not going to respond adequately to any of the specific questions, but I'm struck by the extent to which all of these debates do come back to politics. And I think sometimes we get diverted from that priority. And actually post-COVID, you see everybody wants to talk about science. Science is important. I mean, there are technical issues that are important, but the problem, from my perspective, is in the past 2 decades in particular, we've moved away from trying to find political solutions to these kinds of issues. Politics requires dialogue. It requires bringing people to the table. It requires, and I think this is actually one of the things that is really exciting about this meeting, it requires returning to a kind of emphasis on South-South cooperation and dialogue that has been completely distorted and diverted over the course of the past 2 decades into a North-South, absolutely hegemonic kind of thing that separates out. I was struck by Fatima talking at the start of this meeting about how Latin America has sort of been left out of the whole discussion in this most recent period, as if somehow health issues were resolved for Latin America because they did a good job of dealing with HIV for a couple of decades. But that's not what's happening now. It's going all downhill because the political context is going downhill. So from my perspective, all of the issues are how to bring together these 2 movements in terms of a more effective dialogue about the common political structures that are making it impossible for us to find priorities, to work together, to build cooperation across the kind of North-South hierarchy that is constantly being reasserted by the structure of the current international system and the way that it's organized.
Yes? Okay. Yeah, I think it's a very good discussion that we're having. I think the greatest threat to health is climate. And so I don't think we are everybody in this room is probably not trying to think, well, are we aligned? Do we see how we are important to each other? It's now, how do we move as one? I think that's the question that we need to kind of have the discussions going. I just came from a Global Fund Advocates Network meeting. So those civil society actors that pressure the Global Fund to get replenishments. And it's interesting to hear the debates from the Global Fund. Their struggles with these governments are around just keeping the stuff that they need, getting that in. They can't barely able to get what they need. So they don't want to rock the boat because they fear that this is now for what we basically need, the commodities, the ARVs, the malaria, all of that. They're worried that if we start talking about also climate and also this. It was interesting, I was struck by a comment from Diane Stewart, who was the Global Fund, and she said, but the Global Fund has not been the Global Fund for 3 diseases for so long. We are the Global Fund now for health. I was like, but your name says for malaria, TB, and HIV. You act vertically. So how do you expect people to think of you? So we came up, there was this concept of diagonalization. I don't know how this is going to translate, but you are not immediately vertical, but you're not immediately across, but you're going incrementally to show how these things are connected. So I think from the health perspective, we are moving from single disease to more health. And now what we need to do is say health and climate, health and social protection. There's a whole gender lens as well that we can see here. There's a whole socioeconomic problem. So I think that's, as a groundswell of civil society, we need to take some of those key parts in. Thanks.
Is there any other free comment? Okay.
Sim, bueno, obrigado pela provocação da colega brasileira. La verdad no, creo que no tengo mucho más que agregar, solo que coincidir en un 1000% con lo que dijo Richard de no olvidar la política y eso se refleja también y lo digo desde mi punto de vista como periodista y las muchas veces que me tocó cubrir temas de salud, temas de clima, de hablar con ministros de estos temas, de hablar con organizaciones también, organizaciones como las que están acá. Y creo que no sé si la cosa va necesariamente por un único mensaje. Ahí la discusión de cómo hacer esa comunicación, de cómo hablarle a la gente es bien particular, tiene que seguir cierta estrategia. Concuerdo con que no es lo mismo la incidencia, no es necesariamente el mismo mensaje de incidencia que el mismo mensaje que se le entrega a la ciudadanía. No creo que ninguno sea desechable, creo que todos son importantes, creo que no hay agenda política, no hay cambio que no se hace sin la gente. Y eso requiere un trabajo arduo, pero trabajo coordinado, sin nunca dejar de lado la política. Yo creo que ahí está el cambio, ahí está, es la única forma de lograrlo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. We will have to wrap up this session. I just wanted to make a final comment and kind of answer a bit on your comment on Africa and how to engage health in the climate policies. Actually, going back to your presentation, Richard, I was super inspired by this win that the HIV movement achieved by long and coordinating efforts of activists that could overturn a complete consensus on an impossible action. It just made me think about, we have the same situation with the energy transition here. Yeah, there's a consensus that it is so hard and it's going to hurt communities. But actually putting health in the center of climate policies can bring so many incredible benefits for health and for economy at the end. So how do we do that? Well, critical instrument for climate policy are the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions of every country to the Paris Agreement to achieving its goal. So GCHA has analyzed all of the NDCs of every country in the world, and we find that most governments recognize the health impacts of climate change. They include it. And Latin American governments are actually leaders on including many aspects of health in their NDCs. For example, Argentina is the first country in the world that included a mitigation target for its health sector. Colombia has worked with the Pan American Health Organization to calculate the benefits across sectors from climate action, so from agriculture, energy, transport, how many lives are saved, what does it mean in terms of costs. So we have instruments and we need to ensure that health is at the table of discussion and decision making, and we can do this together. Thank you so much for this productive session.
So just a warning, yeah, sorry, mistranslation. Everyone has to be back here by 2 p.m., okay, but lunch will be at the hotel across the street. So I'm sorry we couldn't get more questions. We ended up going way over our allocated time, but the panelists' contacts will be available and also the presentations. Thank you.